He'd been driving the same route for 30 years, picking up young soldiers heading to base, until the night 3 Marines got in his cab and recognized the scar on his hand. What happened next would change everything they thought they knew about the quiet old man behind the wheel. Welcome to Human Stories. Before we begin this incredible tale of hidden service and unexpected recognition, tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from today? And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, hit that subscribe button. These stories matter. The yellow cab had seen better days. Paint peeling around the edges, vinyl seats cracked from decades of use, and a radio that only picked up AM stations clearly. But it ran, and more importantly, it knew the route by heart. Highway 101 to Camp Pendleton, the same stretch of California asphalt that Frank Morrison had been driving since 1994. Frank didn't look like much behind the wheel. 68 years old, gray stubble, reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck. He wore the same thing every shift: faded blue work shirt, khaki pants, and a Giants baseball cap that had lost most of its color years ago. His hands, weathered and scarred, gripped the steering wheel with the kind of steady control that only comes from repetition. He picked up the night shift by choice, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., when most of the other drivers had gone home to their families. Frank didn't have a family to go home to, not anymore. So he drove. LAX to Pendleton, Pendleton to LAX, sometimes downtown LA if a fare was good enough. But mostly it was the Marines. Young faces, fresh cuts, duffel bags slung over shoulders. They'd pile into his cab after flights from Paris Island, Fort Benning, or home on leave. Most of them barely looked at him. Just another old taxi driver in a city full of them. They'd give him the address, plug in their headphones, and stare out the window at the California coast flying by. Frank preferred it that way. He'd learned long ago that sometimes the best service you could provide was silence. Let them think, let them process, let them prepare for whatever was waiting at the base or back home. He'd seen enough young soldiers over the years to recognize the look, the nervousness before deployment, the exhaustion after, the hollow stare of someone who'd seen too much too young. He never asked questions, never offered advice, just drove steady, kept the radio low, and got them where they needed to go safely. It was honest work, and after everything he'd been through, honest work felt like enough. The routine rarely changed. Frank would park outside Terminal 3 at LAX around 6:30 p.m., right where the military flights usually came in. He'd wait, sometimes for hours, reading the same paperback novel he'd been carrying for months. When Marines walked out in their utilities or dress blues, he'd roll down his window and call out, "Camp Pendleton?" 9 times out of 10, they needed the ride. The drive took about an hour and 40 minutes, depending on traffic. Frank knew every shortcut, every backup route, every construction zone from here to Oceanside. He could do it in his sleep, and some nights it felt like he was. The same exit ramps, the same radio towers, the same billboards advertising things he'd never buy. But Frank never got tired of the drive itself. There was something peaceful about the California coast at night. The way the headlights carved through the darkness, the distant glow of San Diego to the south, the sound of waves you couldn't see but knew were there, just beyond the highway barriers. Sometimes the Marines would talk. About home, about training, about girlfriends or wives they'd left behind. Frank would listen without commenting, offering nothing more than the occasional "yeah" or "I hear that." He wasn't their therapist or their father figure. He was just the guy getting them from point A to point B. Other times they'd stay quiet the whole ride. Frank understood that too. Sometimes you needed the silence to sort through whatever was rattling around in your head. He'd learned that lesson a long time ago, in a place far from California highways and yellow cabs. That Thursday night started like any other. Frank pulled up to his usual spot at Terminal 3 around 6:45 p.m. The October air was cool, typical for LA in the fall. He'd grabbed his usual coffee from the cart outside baggage claim, black, no sugar, and settled in with his book. A worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea that he'd read probably 50 times, but never seemed to finish. The military flight from Quantico was running late. Frank didn't mind. Time moved differently at airports. You learned to wait, to watch people hurry toward destinations you'd never see, to be patient with schedules that changed without warning. Around 8:20 p.m., he spotted them. 3 Marines in dress blues walking through the automatic doors, dress bags slung over their shoulders. They moved with that particular combination of confidence and exhaustion that Frank had learned to recognize. These weren't fresh recruits. These were seasoned Marines, probably returning from leave or a temporary assignment. Frank rolled down his passenger window and called out, "Camp Pendleton?" The tallest one, a lance corporal with close-cropped dark hair, looked over and nodded. "You got room for 3? "Always got room for Marines," Frank replied, popping the trunk. They loaded their bags and climbed in. The lance corporal took the front seat while the other two, a Hispanic Marine who couldn't have been more than 22 and a stocky redhead with sergeant stripes, settled in the back. "Evening, fellas," Frank said as he pulled away from the curb. "How long you been traveling?" "About 14 hours, the lance corporal answered. His name tag read Rodriguez. "Flight delays out of D.C., connection problems in Dallas, you know how it goes." Frank nodded, merging into the evening traffic heading south on the 405. "I know how it goes. You boys hungry? There's a good 24-hour diner about halfway if you want to stop." "Nah, we're good," Rodriguez said. "Just want to get back to base. Got formation at 0600. The conversation settled into the usual rhythm. Where they were coming from, special training exercise at Quantico, how long they'd been in. Rodriguez had 6 years, the others were newer. What they thought about the Dodgers' chances next season, mixed opinions. Frank drove steady, keeping his speed just under the limit. He'd learned long ago that getting pulled over cost more time than any shortcut could save. The radio played softly, some late-night talk show he wasn't really listening to, just background noise to fill the spaces between conversation. About 40 minutes into the drive, somewhere between Irvine and San Juan Capistrano, the redhead in the back seat leaned forward. "Hey, driver," he said. "You mind if I ask you something?" Frank glanced in the rearview mirror. The Marine's name tag read Sullivan. "Shoot." "That scar on your hand," Sullivan said, nodding toward Frank's right hand on the steering wheel. "That's not from fixing cars, is it?" Frank's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on the wheel. The scar Sullivan was referring to ran from his knuckles to his wrist, a thin white line that had faded over the years but never disappeared completely. Most people never noticed it, or if they did, they assumed it was from his work as a mechanic before he started driving cab. But Sullivan wasn't most people. "Old injury," Frank said simply, not taking his eyes off the road. Sullivan studied the scar more carefully, then looked at Frank's profile in the rearview mirror. Something clicked. "That's shrapnel," Sullivan said quietly. "I've seen enough of those to know." The cab went quiet except for the hum of the engine and the distant sound of traffic. Rodriguez turned to look at Sullivan, then back at Frank. The Hispanic Marine, whose name tag read Vasquez, sat up straighter. Frank didn't respond immediately. He'd hoped this day would never come, that he could drive his routes and fade into the background like he had for 30 years. But he'd always known it was possible. Scars had a way of telling stories whether you wanted them to or not. "You serve?" Rodriguez asked, his voice carrying a different tone now. Not the casual friendliness of a passenger talking to his driver, but something else. Recognition, maybe. Respect. Frank kept his eyes on the road, but his jaw tightened slightly. "Long time ago." "How long?" Vasquez asked. Frank was quiet for almost a mile. The lights of San Juan Capistrano passed by the windows, late-night diners and gas stations creating pools of yellow light in the darkness. Finally, he spoke. 68 to 72. The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet that had filled the cab earlier. This was heavy, loaded with unspoken understanding. Vietnam, the kind of service that didn't come with parades when you got home. "What unit?" Sullivan asked softly. Frank's hands shifted on the steering wheel. The scar caught the light from an oncoming car, making it more visible for just a moment. "1st Recon Battalion," he said. 3rd Marine Division. The 3 Marines in the cab went completely still. 1st Recon, deep reconnaissance, The guys who went into places that didn't exist on maps, who gathered intelligence behind enemy lines, who often didn't come back. Rodriguez turned in his seat to face Frank more directly. "Sir," he said, and the word carried weight now. "First recon in Vietnam, that was some serious stuff." Frank nodded once, barely perceptible. "We did our job." "How many tours?" Vasquez asked. "3. Sullivan let out a low whistle. "3 tours with first recon." Jesus. They were passing through Dana Point now, the Pacific Ocean visible in the distance as a dark expanse under the star-filled sky. Frank had made this drive thousands of times, but tonight it felt different, heavier somehow. "Is that where you got the scar?" Rodriguez asked. Frank's jaw worked silently for a moment. He could lie. Change the subject. Turn up the radio and pretend he hadn't heard the question. But something in the way these young Marines were looking at him, the respect in their voices, made him think of other young Marines from a long time ago. "Hue City," he said quietly. "February 1968. Took shrapnel from a mortar round. Medic patched me up with dental floss and duct tape. Kept fighting for 6 more hours until the area was secure. The Battle of Hue. Even these young Marines knew that name. Urban warfare at its worst. House-to-house fighting that lasted for weeks. Some of the most intense combat of the entire Vietnam War." "How old were you?" Sullivan asked. 21. Vasquez shook his head. "I'm 22 now. Can't imagine." Frank glanced at him in the mirror. "Hope you never have to, son." They were getting close to Camp Pendleton now. Frank could see the lights of Oceanside in the distance. In another 20 minutes, these 3 Marines would get out of his cab and go back to their lives. And Frank would drive back to LAX, or maybe call it a night and go home to his small apartment in Long Beach. But something had changed in the cab. The air felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Rodriguez was studying Frank's profile intently. "Sir," he said slowly, "I know this might sound crazy, but have we met before?" Frank's eyebrows raised slightly. "Don't think so, son. I'd remember." "No, I mean," Rodriguez paused, thinking. "I've heard stories from my grandfather. He was a Marine in Vietnam, too. He used to tell me about this recon Marine who saved his squad during Hue. Guy took shrapnel, but kept fighting, called in artillery on his own position to break up a VC assault." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "My grandfather's name was Staff Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez," Rodriguez continued. "3rd Battalion, 7th Marines. He said the recon Marine who saved them was named Morrison. Frank Morrison." The cab went dead silent except for the sound of the engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. Frank pulled off the highway at the Camp Pendleton exit, but instead of heading straight to the main gate, he pulled into a 24-hour gas station and parked under the bright fluorescent lights. He put the car in park, but left the engine running. He turned in his seat to look at Rodriguez directly for the first time. "Miguel Rodriguez," Frank said quietly. "Kid from East L.A., always talking about his girl back home, Maria. Said he was going to marry her as soon as he got back." Rodriguez's eyes went wide. "That's him. That's my grandfather. He did marry her. My grandmother, Maria. They had 5 kids, including my dad." Frank nodded slowly. "Miguel was a good Marine. Steady under fire, never complained even when things got bad." "He passed away 2 years ago," Rodriguez said, his voice thick with emotion. "Cancer. But he talked about you right up until the end. Said you saved his life in Hue City. Said he never got to thank you properly." Frank looked down at his hands, at the scar that had started this conversation. "He didn't need to thank me. That's what Marines do." Sullivan leaned forward. "Sir, with respect, what you did was more than just what Marines do. My dad was in the Corps too, different war, but he told me about guys like you. Recon Marines who went behind enemy lines, who called in danger-close artillery to save regular infantry units. That takes something special." Frank started to shake his head, but Vasquez spoke up. "My uncle served too. Army, but he always said the Marines he fought alongside were different, especially the recon guys. Said they were like ghosts. There one minute, gone the next, but always exactly where they needed to be when things got bad." Frank sat quietly for a long moment, looking through the windshield at the bright lights of the gas station. A couple of late-night travelers were filling up their cars, completely unaware of the conversation taking place in the yellow taxi parked near the air pump. Finally, he spoke. "Your grandfather ever tell you what happened after Hue?" Rodriguez shook his head. "He said you disappeared. One day you were there, next day you were gone. No goodbye, no forwarding address, just gone," Frank nodded. "That's how it worked with recon. When your tour was up or when you got too banged up to be effective, they pulled you out quiet. No ceremonies, no speeches, just gone." "But you stayed in country," Sullivan said. It wasn't a question. "2 more tours," Frank confirmed. "Different units, different missions, places I can't talk about even now." "And then?" Vasquez asked. Frank looked at each of them in turn. "Then I came home. 1972. There weren't any parades for guys like me. No welcome home parties, just a plane ticket to LAX and a bus ride to wherever you wanted to go." He gestured around the cab. "Started driving taxi 6 months later. Been doing it ever since. Seemed like honest work, and after everything that happened over there, honest work felt like enough." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his photos until he found what he was looking for. "Sir," he said, holding the phone out toward Frank, "this is my grandfather's funeral. Military honors, 21-gun salute, the whole thing. But you know what he requested?" Frank looked at the photo. It showed an American flag being folded by Marines in dress blues, with an older woman, presumably Rodriguez's grandmother, receiving it with tears in her eyes. He asked that if anyone ever found Frank Morrison, the recon Marine from Hue City, to tell him thank you, Rodriguez continued, and to tell him that Miguel Rodriguez lived a full life because of what he did that day. Frank stared at the photo for a long time. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He was a good Marine," Frank said again, his voice rough with emotion. "They all were. I just did what needed doing." Sullivan cleared his throat. "Sir, I don't think you understand. What you did, what all you recon guys did, it rippled forward. Rodriguez here is third-generation Marine because of what you did for his grandfather. Vasquez's uncle came home and raised 6 kids who all served their communities. My dad made it through his deployment because he learned from Marines who learned from guys like you." Frank looked around the cab at these 3 young Marines, seeing not just them, but echoes of all the young faces he'd carried over the years. How many sons and grandsons of Vietnam veterans had he driven to and from Camp Pendleton without ever knowing it? "You boys need to get to base," he said finally, putting the car back in drive. "Sir," Rodriguez said as Frank pulled back onto the road, "would it be okay if I got your contact information? I'd like to stay in touch. Maybe introduce you to my grandmother sometime. I think she'd like to meet you." Frank was quiet as they approached the main gate of Camp Pendleton. The Marine guards were visible in their checkpoint, and beyond them, the lights of the base spread out like a small city. "I'll think about it," he said finally. Frank pulled up to the passenger drop-off area near the main gate. The 3 Marines gathered their bags from the trunk, but instead of just walking away like thousands of passengers before them, they stood beside the cab. Rodriguez approached the driver's side window. "Sir, what do we owe you for the ride?" Frank waved him off. "On the house, professional courtesy." But Rodriguez wasn't having it. He pulled out his wallet and placed 3 $20 bills on the dashboard. "That's not for the ride," he said. "That's for Miguel Rodriguez, for every Marine who came home because of what you did, for every grandson who got to grow up with his grandfather because you were there when it mattered." Before Frank could protest, Sullivan and Vasquez approached the window too. "Sir," Sullivan said, "I know this might be presumptuous, but would you mind if we saluted you?" Frank started to shake his head, but Vasquez spoke up. "With respect, sir, you earned it, and we need to do this." Frank sat quietly for a moment, then slowly nodded. The 3 Marines stepped back and came to attention in perfect synchronization. They rendered sharp salutes, holding them with the precision that only comes from years of training and genuine respect. Frank looked at them through the windshield, these 3 young Marines saluting an old taxi driver under the fluorescent lights of a military base entrance. Slowly, he raised his right hand, the one with the scar, and returned their salute. They held the moment for several seconds, then dropped their salutes in unison. Rodriguez approached the window one more time. "Sir," he said, "I meant what I said about staying in touch. My grandmother would really like to meet you, and I think you might like to meet her too." Frank reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, white cardstock with black text, Frank Morrison, taxi service, and a phone number. "Call me next week," he said, handing the card to Rodriguez. "We'll see." The three Marines shouldered their bags and walked toward the main gate, where the guards were checking IDs and waving them through. Frank sat in his cab for several minutes, watching them disappear into the base, thinking about Miguel Rodriguez and Hue City and all the years that had passed between then and now. Finally, he put the car in drive and headed back toward the highway. But instead of returning to LAX for another fare, he found himself driving toward Long Beach, toward his small apartment where he'd been living alone for 30 years. As he drove, Frank Morrison, former 1st Recon Battalion Marine, taxi driver, keeper of quiet stories, allowed himself to think about the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop disappearing. The scar on his hand caught the light from oncoming traffic, and for the first time in decades, Frank didn't try to hide it. 3 days later, Frank's phone rang. It was Rodriguez, calling during his lunch break from base. Frank found himself accepting an invitation to Sunday dinner with Rodriguez's grandmother in East LA. The following Sunday, Frank Morrison walked up to a small house with a neat front yard and flowers planted along the walkway. When the door opened, an elderly woman with kind eyes and gray hair looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. "Frank Morrison," she said softly, "I've been waiting to meet you for 50 years. That afternoon, over homemade tamales and stories that had been carried in silence for too long, Frank learned that Miguel Rodriguez had indeed lived a full life. 5 children, 14 grandchildren, a successful business, and 52 years of marriage to the girl he'd talked about in Vietnam. And for the first time since 1972, Frank Morrison stopped being just a taxi driver and allowed himself to remember that he had once been something more. But that, as they say, is another story. So now I ask you, have you ever encountered someone whose quiet service went unnoticed until one small detail revealed their incredible past? Have you met a taxi driver, a janitor, a clerk who turned out to be carrying the weight of history in their hands? Share their story in the comments below. Tell us about the hidden heroes you've discovered in the most ordinary places. And if this story moved you, subscribe to Human Stories. We're here to honor the men and women who served quietly, who carry their stories without boasting, who remind us that sometimes the most powerful warriors are hiding in plain sight. Thank you for watching. And remember, next time you meet someone who seems ordinary, look a little closer. You might be surprised by the extraordinary story they're carrying. Until next time, keep listening. The best stories are often told in whispers.